Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Lead Strong. My name's Stephanie Hopper. I'm one of the directors of the talent practice at Capfinity, specialising in talent development, and joined by my fabulous co-host, Celine Floyd, who will introduce herself shortly. A few words on Capfinity. We're a global business. We're based in Birmingham, London, Dublin, various US locations, and Sydney. And we've been helping organisations to find candidates, develop employees, and transform their business around our USP of strengths-based assessment and development for over 16 years. Both Celine and I work on Altitude, which is Capfinity's leadership proposition. It's a market-leading method of assessing and developing your leaders through a strengths lens. Celine.
Thank you, Steph. Hi, everybody. Delighted to see you again for what is our 15th episode, as Steph said. And the topic of our conversation today is around innovation and the role of leadership within driving innovation within organisations. So, as Steph says, Celine Floyd, I'm the other co-director of Capfinity's talent practice, and my area of specialism is predominantly in leadership assessment. So, working to profile leaders for the purposes of selection and development, typically in organisations, large organisations globally. We are joined today by another two fantastic guests, Andy and Andy, and we might make this a new rule, might be Steph, that if you join our session, you have to have the same name. Yeah, it's fun and games. So over the course of half an hour, we're going to try to work out how to reference you both, maybe something a bit more innovative than Andy S and Andy B. That could be the challenge that we set ourselves. But perhaps I can hand over to you both to introduce yourselves to our audience today, and perhaps why you're interested specifically in the area of leadership. I will come to Andy B first, please. Hello, welcome.
Thank you very much, Celine, Steph. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Yes, I am Andy B. I'm known as Brit sometimes. So actually in Purplebricks, we had two Andy B's on the executive team. Unbelievable. So I actually go by the reference of Brit. So you can use Brit if you want. Andy B, Andy. You can call me Andrew. That's what my mum does. But anyway, so lovely to be with you all. Thank you. So I'm Andy Britcliffe. I'm currently Chief Digital Officer at Purplebricks, the UK's leading estate agent. I am actually a software engineer by background. So I kind of think of my career in three distinct parts. The first part was very much around, learning my craft as a software engineer. So I worked in a range of different businesses, including small businesses. I had a stint at Microsoft, really just, understanding lots of different ways to solve problems with software and technology. In the middle stint, I decided to do a startup, which was a phenomenal experience, failed miserably, as most startups do, but it was dog years in terms of experience. And then kind of picking on the back of that, for the last sort of 10 or so years, I've been in senior leadership positions, so kind of CTO, but with a very much commercial and product mindset. And so this kind of leads me to Purplebricks today, where I look after our digital experience for our customers or agents, which I thoroughly enjoy because it gives me a great chance to really do what I'm passionate about, which is solve problems. And for me, really, leadership is just a mechanism to help me solve problems, because you can't do anything on your own at scale. And so what I'm passionate about is working with great people, really thinking about the idea of context over control. And I think that's why I'm quite excited about the new normal, where we, pre-pandemic, I think the control mindset was possibly, you've got to be in an office, I've got to see you all. That's one style of leadership and management. I'm very much around autonomy and responsibility. And so for me, that's really exciting, and it matches how I like to lead, how I like to operate teams. And having onboarded at Purplebricks through the pandemic, so I started off fully remote. It's been an interesting tale, but it's been very successful. So that's me.
Amazing, wonderful, thank you. So pleased that you can join us. And Andy, hi.
Hello. Well, my surname's Stephen, so that's another option if you want to mix it up.
Brit and Stephen,
yeah,
do that.
Perfect. My wife loves it when she gets called Steve on email, so we should maybe go with that. So I'm Andrew Stephen, Andrew number 2. I'm currently an advisor to a couple of businesses, the Zero Carbon Forum and Foodsteps, who are both in different ways trying to decarbonise food. Previous to that, I spent 5 years as the chief executive of the Sustainable Restaurant Association, which is a bit of a mouthful, but again, that was a membership organisation focused on food and climate change. And I guess for about the last 15 years, I've been in leadership roles, trying to help businesses embrace the climate emergency and not run a mile and trying to find some sort of business opportunity in that kind of innovation potential. So I guess the reason I'm interested in leadership is, well, I personally want to get better at it and kind of understand it more in terms of the kind of the practice of leadership. And I think right now where we stand through my work with people like the Zero Carbon Forum, I'm sort of trying to influence 28 leaders of other businesses that turn over from a few hundred million to a couple of billion each about how they lead into a net zero economy. So I guess their role as leaders is something that really interests me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve and Britt. I love it. So today we're going to talk about really driving innovation as leaders. And I guess, you know, contrary to popular belief, innovation doesn't have to be cutting edge or disruptive or big picture. That's often the sort of innovation that we maybe all hanker after or remember. You know, there are lots of other types of innovation that we see, and the reality is that is just one type of it. And I guess probably something that's more commonly seen perhaps in a startup environment rather than in really large organizations. And a recent Centre for Creative Leadership survey from 2020 of 500 senior leaders found that innovation is a key driver of success for 94% of organizations. And through that research, they noticed that 77% of them had tried to promote innovation in some way, but only 14% of that group said they were confident about their ability to drive innovation effectively. So the desire to innovate really exists, but it's much harder to implement in reality. So our first question really to both of you is, how do you think leaders can actively encourage and nurture innovation within companies? So sometimes that's referred to as entrepreneurship, but what can we do to sort of create that sort of culture and that environment? Let me come to Steve first of all.
Well, I'll start with a story, and it was actually back in 2006, an organisation called Work Group that both Gillian and I worked for at the time, and I joined 2 years previous on their grad scheme, and we were basically in the business of selling recruitment advertising, mostly in print, to large organisations that needed to recruit lots of people. But I guess I'd just done my master's and was kind of secretly kind of interested in a job that was more involved with climate change. And rather than just going straight out and looking for another role, I went and had a chat with the MD and the CEO and said, hey, I think we've got a really big opportunity here to create a new kind of business unit focused on sustainability and communications to our clients. And I guess what's interesting is why I felt like that was okay and why they then had the confidence to kind of back it. So I think that that's just, I guess, a time where even from a really, as a relatively junior member of staff, I felt like that organisational culture, that kind of reciprocal trust, kind of customer focus, was there that made me feel like that was okay, way before I was kind of a leader or thought about kind of the structures that sat behind that. I think kind of fast forward kind of 10, 15 years, I think the sorts of things that I see a lot of organizations doing now is, I guess, trying to almost like borrow bits from other industries. A couple of key bits of borrowing I see from software, and kind of borrowing the idea of kind of sprints and kind of defined bursts of activity around testing stuff and failing fast. I think that's sort of like, sort of management structure, if you like, I see being used kind of in lots of other organizations. And the second borrow I around bringing innovation in is maybe from the not-for-profit world, in which charities have for a while thought a bit more than businesses about their kind of theory of change. And whilst a good business growth plan will consider competitors and other people in that ecosystem, often they define as competitors and look quite short-term. Whereas I think other not-for-profit organizations, when they're thinking of theories of change, will do a much more robust job of understanding the ecosystem within which they exist and who else is working in it. And I think, maybe a bit of both of those things could be quite interesting to think about how to unlock innovation.
Yeah, really good example though, that one of feeling able to go and suggest something and feeling empowered to be able to do that. And as you said, that reciprocal trust there, and then also the borrowing from other industries. I love you might all have heard of this before. There's that amazing story about Great Ormond Street and the cardiac surgeons and how they needed to speed up the whole process of what went on in terms of, when you took someone in to operate on them. And they apparently went to Formula One pit stops and then tried to lift exactly what was done there, and watch the way those teams work together as an example of how they could transfer across. Britt, what are your thoughts here on how we can actively encourage and nurture innovation?
Yeah, well, I think I would certainly agree with what Andrew said previously, actually. I mean, culture is a significant part of this. So I guess in my career, I kind of lived and breathed innovation, although I think innovation is a catch-all term, right? It's about trying to, I guess, solve problems and get great outcomes for the problems you're trying to solve. I kind of typically bucket innovation into kind of two distinct areas. So I think you've got the 0 to 1 innovation, which is your startups, which is kind of creating something from fresh, really, that radical thinking. And I think typically that's where your startup ecosystem stems from. And that's, super important, but that's hard, really hard, because you're really trying to create something from nothing. And then I think you've got the 1 to N innovation, which is probably more what we're talking about, where you're trying to move to the next level. And it could be significant steps, but it could be marginal gains, right? But that's still important. So just to reference the story, I think it was Dave Brailsford, who was the Team GB cycling coach, who phenomenal. We'll all know kind of the amazing records that team did. But he was obsessed by the 1% gains. Yeah. And so the one that stands out for me was that all the riders would take their own pillows to every hotel that they went to, the bedding and pillows, because a good night's sleep, unsurprisingly, is absolutely vital for top performance for everybody, right? But especially if you're trying to bike 300 kilometers the next day at pace. So that kind of insight and bundled together creates an innovation in its own right, but it's not, we're not inventing Uber or something brand new, right? It's this idea of marginal gain. So I think those are the two kind of buckets that I think about, and I think you've got to try and, as a leader in an enterprise, try and hedge bets between those, because there's definitely differences of how you approach those around that. I think culturally, why it's so difficult, and actually I was intrigued by the stats. So I'd love to know who the 23% of organisations that are not trying to push innovation, because I'd go short their stock now, because they're going to struggle. They're really going to struggle. But I do think culturally, right, you have to be very comfortable with failure, as Andrew talked about again, and kind of test, learn, and iterate. Because contrary to belief, I don't believe anyone sits there quietly in a room thinking deeply, going, "Ha, I've got it." Just doesn't work. You have to go and stress test lots of ideas, test them, iterate on them, use data heavily, and you need a culture of failure, because a lot of them fail. I think if I was to pick out, I think Amazon are probably the world's best at this mindset, hence where they are, because from the very foundations, Jeff Bezos breeds a culture of failure is acceptable. It's got to be the right kind of failure. You don't get away with just failing because you can't be bothered, but actually if you're trying to innovate, if you're trying to push the envelope, that creates that cycle of actually the innovations that they create, and obviously the incredible success that they see. Traditional corporate organizations, and I'm generalizing, so apologies, but I'm sure everyone can recognize this. Failure is deemed as a weakness, right? If you're around an executive table, not every organization is comfortable with you failing. And the trouble is then, if people are afraid to fail, you're afraid to try anything new. And I think that's where you get status quo. And I think that's where you will struggle with innovation. And I think that's really key. And I think the other distinct part of this is the classic innovator's dilemma. It's like when you're in a successful working business, you still got to innovate and grow that business. However, over time, you will face competition if there's a market there that's addressable. And what's a killer about it is that it's not like you're sitting one day and your platform's on fire. We got to do something. It's a slow seep of what you're doing as a business, and that's really hard to do, because to counter that, you have to cannibalize your own business. And again, culturally, that's extremely difficult. So I think that's kind of how I would frame it and think about it.
Brilliant. Yeah, I love that, and I love the what you were saying about failure, actually, because you're absolutely right that it is often just deemed as a weakness and not made something that people are comfortable with, and then they kind of carry that burden as well, which must stop so much innovation that's needed. I love the fact that Dave Brailsford told the French press that we had round wheels, because they were all like, what's the secret of the UK cycling team? And he was like, incremental gains, and they weren't having any of it. They were like, no, there's definitely something going on. And he was like, we've got round wheels. That's what it is. We've got round wheels.
Brilliant. Thank you. It was really interesting to hear. And when you were talking there about innovation, I was struck by how I think it's easy for us perhaps to have quite an archaic and maybe caricature view of what innovation means. And, you know, this idea that you, as you say, you go into a dark room and you have this light bulb come up, you know, like that visual, that's just not what it needs to look like now. That's what it looks like, what it needs to look like. So, and I guess that leads us on to our next question, really, because I think if we think back to this theme of it being almost caricature-like, I think if we think about innovation and working in an organisation or a culture that really drives innovation, you can think of all the really like wonderful things about it, and you can think, oh, it's going to be really fun, you know, it's going to be really fresh. There's lots of fresh ideas. People are going to be kind of really energized. You know, it's going to be a safe place. But of course, there's a dark side, isn't there, to the kind of innovation coin? And we know with some organisations where they're pushing innovation, some of the, I guess, byproducts of that can be, for example, a failure to finish things, right? Like a lack of accountability, a lack of ownership over certain things. So there is a bright and a dark side to it. So interested in your experience both around, you know, I guess the challenges to innovation that leaders face. And we've touched upon some of these already, but maybe useful to explore it more. You know, what are the challenges that leaders face to innovation, and what are some of the things that you've seen good leaders do to overcome some of this kind of dark side of innovation? Maybe back to Britt first of all on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Celine. Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I mean, the dark side of innovation is business as usual, right? Because there's always a lot to do as business as usual, and as a business, you can get swallowed up by business as usual. So I think, you know, for me, what I've observed and kind of what I've tried to apply is being very deliberate around innovation. So you have to talk about it at the top table, and you have to be very deliberate. Go, do we want to innovate? Are we all engaged in this? Because again, if you've got, I don't know, pet projects, siloed approach, you will always find things that will undo any work that's happening. So I think it starts with a collective view of we want to innovate, we want to drive change, and then I think it's about being very deliberate around how you invest. You know, because these things don't come for free, right? It's a bet, and then you get into ROI and these sort of, and not actually, it's especially actually in software and running software engineering teams. You know, there's always I've had many conversations over years with CFOs around what's the ROI on that, and how do we measure the cost of that? And it's like, I get it, but actually, it's a creative endeavor creating software because you're problem solving, and actually we don't know the answer. And so to then say, well, actually the answer is this, and it will return this is virtually impossible. Now you can try, obviously, you do work and you try to be educated, but I do think that you have to have a mindset around it's an investment. You know, it's like investing in an early stage business, or there's a bet there. You like the team, you like the idea. We can't guarantee it could all fall flat, and actually probably it will. But we have to be prepared. That's what we're willing to do to create the upside. And then it's creating a culture and an environment around that. So some of the things, so we, for example, at Purplebricks, every 2 weeks, we have what we call an innovation day. And so we allow our teams, we invest that in our team. So that's a full day. So if you do the maths on a 100-person team, 100-man days every 2 weeks, that's a lot of money we invest to generate ideas or give the team a chance to look at things and think things differently. So that's just one example where we're putting our money where our mouth is to try and drive that. Very similar, Google did the 20% time, lots of, so I'm not saying we've invented anything new here, but I do think it shows this idea of being very deliberate around how you think about innovation, that it's agreed from a top down that we're going to invest in this and we do this. And that, for me as the leader of kind of our digital capability, I'm there at demos, I'm there watching what's doing, I'm feeding in, I'm joining them in, because then they feel engagement from me. So they believe it's actually part of what we're trying to do. So that's probably one simple example where I've applied some learning, some knowledge and understanding around that to try and, give a space where it's not just being swallowed by BAU, because BAU could be 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, no doubt about it.
I love that. I love the messaging there around, actually, say putting your money where your mouth is, acknowledging the importance of it, and the role modelling that you described, which I think is really important with any kind of culture change or trait that you're trying to create. Andy S., does that resonate with what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to talk about the challenge of anything in the workplace without kind of acknowledging what's just happened over the last couple of years, right? So there's been a huge amount of disruption, huge amount of resource constraint. There's been some real winners, but most people's business as usual has been threatened, and that they're now trying to do like more stuff with less people in an environment in which people are spending less time interacting with each other physically, and I guess there are less kind of triggers and cues for leaders about where people are and their kind of motivation and alignment. I think for me, kind of, a challenge just full stop around generating kind of an environment in which people feel free and inspired to innovate is, you need people that have got a high degree of customer empathy and a high degree of kind of cause empathy or purpose empathy. You need both of those things. The more you have both those things, the kind of more solid, like fertile soil you've got for kind of the right ideas to grow. And doing that, giving people the ability to grow their kind of customer and cause empathy in an environment where they're waking up and logging on from the end of their bedroom and they haven't even maybe met most of you before in real life. It's a bit of a battle against kind of those roles becoming quite transactional and kind of narrowing in scope, if you like. I think a way out of that I've seen kind of, and particularly the Zero Carbon Forum that I've been working with for the last couple of months, is kind of industry level collaboration around shared challenges. And I think that's both a kind of challenge in itself and an opportunity to find innovation. Zero Carbon Forum are working with 28 of the largest pubs and restaurants and helping them achieve net zero. And there's an unusual level of sharing going on, which has been driven from the top, but then, kind of operational people within those businesses are, I guess, helping each other innovate. And I guess, sort of where you can identify that kind of cause empathy to such an extent that you then permit your people to join collaborative platforms. I think that's a hell of a way of giving a bit of energy and ideas to people who probably know their jobs a bit better than you do, because you allow them to kind of network with other people like them.
Lovely. And I was struck earlier, Andrew, when you were talking about the third sector doing that really well, that kind of industry collaboration. I guess I'm just interested in your views as to why perhaps the more kind of corporate private sector don't do that as much. Have you got a view on why that's the case?
I mean, there's an awful lot that the private sector do a lot better than the third sector. I'm certainly not kind of overall biased. I guess just my experience of sitting down with leadership teams that are doing business growth planning versus sitting down with kind of trustees looking at theories of change are that the latter spend a lot more time focusing on what other people are actually doing, as opposed to kind of narrowly defining them as competitors who are pitching for shared market share. And sure. I think if you're trying to innovate product, service, and your place in the market, the more aware of not just where other people are, but the direction they're traveling as well, and that sort of dynamic view of the future can really help you, I guess, fail less. And I think that often, not-for-profits or kind of third sector, I guess just because of the way they're governed, they spend a little bit more time kind of really understanding that, and there's a little bit more kind of pre-competitive collaboration out of the box for people with higher degree of cause empathy. Maybe that.
I love that. The cause empathy and the fertile soil that you described. And Andy B, the innovation days, which I loved, and like you say, wow, what an investment. I guess I'm intrigued as to how formalised that is. So perhaps can you just explain to the audience a little bit more about what that looks like in practice, how that works?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting actually, because very much in our style we kind of test, learn, and iterate with it. So okay. we kind of vary. So I think it's kind of matured. So we kind of have the concept of hack days, which those of you familiar know is where there would be certain kind of projects or problems that they would spin teams up around and solve problems, and that's kind of one version of it. But we wanted to balance that out, because kind of feedback we got from some of the teams was, maybe there's too much pressure on the idea, we've got to actually generate something and move, So we do cycle the topics. So sometimes we'll have, key things that we think will be interesting for teams to try. Some will be about personal development. Our last one, we actually kind of dedicated to kind of like a mental health day. So we encourage people to get together and get outside and kind of, so it's not all particularly just about kind of, solving problems directly, but helping us collaborate. And actually, Andy makes a really interesting point about kind of the new world we're in and this kind of remote collaboration, which is, I think from my perspective, a net positive, but equally it's not all gold, right? There's, and I think we're exploring ways of how we build those relationships, both virtually. So I think there's some really, I think there's probably fertile ground around remote working, collaboration. I don't go quite as far as kind of the meta world that Zuckerberg's trying to promote, but nonetheless, this idea of kind of how do we create more of that in-person experience virtually, but then also how do we get that physical experience together? Because, undoubtedly, while I don't believe we all need to sit next together 5 days a week checking email, having that human contact time together, brainstorming is super valuable. So I think that's something yet to be solved, how we do that. But I think, and that's part of our thinking around, innovation days, but also general working. How do we get better as a team working together around that? Which I think, it's definitely 2022 onwards kind of problem to be solved. And, it's a global problem, right? Because every enterprise, every kind of organization is facing the same challenges, both in terms of what's expected from employees. People don't want to be in office 5 days a week. I think that's pretty loud and clear. But equally, people do want some human contact and togetherness. So, but also then how do we create the tools to help get that innovation, that creativity, that dynamic of making a difference?
Such a good point, actually, Andy, because that's one of the things that people have talked about, haven't they? That, the remote working has made innovation harder because people perceive innovation as collaborative conversations, often impromptu, which then become more transactional when we're virtual. So, yeah, really good point. Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen, for your time today. I guess some of the themes that I've heard today is, first of all, there's something around, we were all agreed on being comfortable with failure, the need to stress test, use data, but also not be afraid to fail and to try again and to kind of iterate. That really what we want is to solve problems and get great outcomes through innovation, and mustn't forget that as a kind of a purpose. And I guess there needs to be some deliberate intention and investment towards innovating that needs to come from the top of the organization. And then also the kind of industry level collaboration that's seen within the third sector and how powerful that can be, looking at the whole ecosystem and not becoming quite so obsessed as most of us do in the private sector around competitors and so on. So I'd just love a final thought to leave the audience with on this topic. Let me come to Brit first of all.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. So I guess in summary, I would frame it as when thinking about innovation, start with the customer in mind and work backwards. And then I think, as I mentioned, I kind of bucket it into two key areas. And when you're thinking about your innovation investment and how you tackle it, if you've got that 0 to 1 innovation, so, how are you disrupting your own business or how are you creating a completely new, area to play in? That's one part of innovation. But then you've got the 1 to N innovation, which could be marginal gains, as we talked about, or something bigger. But you need to be spending time in both areas, because if you neglect one of those, you're liable for disruption either way. So I think that for me is really key.
Brilliant. And Steve.
Yeah, I guess for me, the kind of, innovation can mean very different things to our own businesses in that category, or just what other subsector and industry we sit within. But I think probably the most universally disruptive innovation that's affecting us all is how to compete in the net zero economy. And I think that is going to hit every business. And as leaders, that a tip would be to get kind of up to speed on your own net zero journey as a business and use that as a lens to help inspire the innovation necessary within your team. Brilliant.
And Celine, a final word from you.
Yeah, I think I've been struck by how easy it is to caricature innovation into something overly simplistic. And I think actually what I've taken away is the greatest thing you can do to have influence on how innovative you are is just to maybe stop and take stock and reflect and to think and to look outwards as opposed to inwards. And whilst we need a focus on outcomes, I think if we can take away the pressure of having to be innovative right now, then actually people's minds will just broaden, and perhaps that's where most of the innovation comes from anyway. So that's been really interesting.
Brilliant. Thank you, Celine. A huge thank you to both Andys for their time today. And we will see you in 2 weeks' time. And we'll be talking then actually about sustainability. So who knows? Andy Stevens might find his way back into the next episode.
Guest appearance, extra
there's plenty more Andys in the sea. It's okay. You'll find another.
But many thanks, and see you all in 2 weeks' time. So
thank
bye.
you both. Thank you.
Bye.